Salim Mansur joins us to continue our discussion on neoconservatism. Hello, Salim.
Hello, Robert. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure as always. We've recently had two long-form discussions on neoconservatism, and I would direct our audience to check them out on our website, justratemedia.org, or on our video channels on YouTube, Rumble, and BitChute. But to quickly recap, neoconservatism refers to the predominant foreign policy of the United States over the past several decades, which is aggressive and interventionist. It was a policy developed over many years and is best exemplified in documents from the Project for the New American Century, or PNAC. And I would again direct our audience to look up those documents to see exactly what we mean by neoconservatism and what the authors mean by neoconservatism. To be clear, neoconservatism is neither new nor conservative. Essentially, it breaks away from the founding foreign policy of the United States, which was best described by then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who, in 1821, said of America, "She goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." That's a constant quotation that we bring up again and again to remind Americans and others that America is not the America that you may have thought it was. Since then, the United States has transformed from a nation to an empire and sees itself as the constabulary of the world. It now has between 800 to 900 military installations around the world and almost 250,000 military personnel stationed abroad. Salim, could you continue our story of neoconservatism and its development so that we might better understand how the United States has veered so far from its glorious roots?
Yes, Robert. I mean, as you reminded our listeners that this is the third conversation, third part of what we have already spent time discussing in the first two parts, that is the historical background and the coming together of what eventually becomes in uh, the recent times, that is around about the turn of the last century, um, the 1990s, late 1980s, and then 1990s, through to where we are right now. So, in a sense, um, it is no longer about the development of neocon. It is about the consummation, the culmination of a neocon agenda, ideas, foreign policies. And if I may remind you, Robert, it was you who introduced in our first discussion, and which then was the thread that we had going through our second discussion, second conversation, Plato's noble lie.
Yes.
And I would say that noble lie continues, that Pinnock was, in that sense, the continuation of the noble lie to put America on a track that took America completely on a different route from that of the founding fathers, as
And
you.
just to recap, though, I mean, the noble lie, for those who may not know Plato, was the concept that there are people who are born to rule. They have gold in their veins. And in order to perpetuate that notion, lies are necessary.
Right. So there are those who are the elect, uh, or who are the exceptional people. And so the idea of exceptionalism, as we discussed in our towards the end of the second conversation, that is put forward. And exceptionalism becomes the sort of branding of America. We are the exceptional state.
In a
Uh,
sense, though, Salim, they are, or at least they were. That's part of my preamble, is that they were quite exceptional. The first state with a written constitution, the first state to establish the people as sovereign as opposed to a monarch.
yeah, but Robert, I would underline that. I mean, what you're saying is quite correct. It was exceptional in the sense that it was the first um, first articulation, first iteration of the ideas of age of enlightenment in a practical sense of how people will arrange their country, write the Constitution. I mean, the founding fathers were, in a sense, the first generation of inheritors of the age of enlightenment, and all of that went into the making of the United States of America following the 1776 revolution. So it is the first articulation. And in that sense, yes, it was exceptional, but you never find anywhere in those early documents and declaration that George Washington or John Adams or Thomas Jefferson or John Madison or any one of those people, Benjamin Franklin saying, we are the exceptional people. In fact, they were saying, which is what Benjamin Franklin said, we have founded a republic if you can keep it. So yes, they were exceptional, but the term exceptional came into political usage and branding in terms of global politics very late in the age. It came in only towards the end of the last century, and then the fusion of the idea of the exceptional people, the elect, America, with the idea of the chosen people. And so again, you have this fusion that takes place, exceptional America, exceptional republic, or exceptionalism, and chosen people. And the underlying notion behind these terms as they're used and came to be used is that binary system. You talk about left, right, and of course this is the just right media. There is neither left nor right, it is one side, and then there's the just right. So in the binary system of our conversation, our discussion, of our describing things, the exceptional people or the chosen people are the good people. They don't do anything wrong. Anything that they engage in is in for what is good. And anybody opposed to them or opposed to the idea that is propounded by the exceptional people, the chosen people, are therefore, by definition, wrong, evil, and need to be fought against or repressed, and so on and so forth. So there is one truth, and that's the truth of the exceptional people, the chosen people, and then there are the rest of the people. And so then that's the noble lie I would suggest is part of the construct. And so the elect are the people who will guide the rest of the people, the flock of sheep, right? And that's back to Plato. The elect have the wisdom, the elect are the philosopher kings, and the rest of the people are sheep, and they need guidance, they need to be herded, and they need to be led. And so that is at the underlying basis. But not drifting too much away from our main point is that the neocon agenda is, and as we discussed in a previous conversation, the completely grounded in the thinking and then subsequently the politics and the narrative that is Jewish in origin. So you're absolutely right. Neocon are neither new, and what was the other thing you described about
conservative? Yeah.
They are neither new, they are neither conservative. They come from another direction, but they take on this branding about themselves as conservative. And that's what happens in the period in American politics post 1945, and more precisely in the period the 1970s and 80s, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so they are the ones who were on the left of American politics, with the Democratic Party. They supported during the beginning of the last century, in the early years of the 20th century, they supported the Russian Revolution. They joined the Democratic Party, and they supported the making of the Jewish state in Palestine, that is through the Balfour Declaration. And we need to keep those two things in mind. Why? Because those are the two ideas or the two agendas of the neocons, right from its inception to where we are right now in the first quarter of the 25th century, in 2025, with Donald Trump returned as the 47th president after the hiatus when the election of 2020 was rigged against him, and his comeback in the 2024 election. So beginning from that point in time, Woodrow Wilson, to coming to where we are in 2025, the lines have become very clear. They are, if I might use the metaphor, they are like the double helix. The two threads have become very pronounced, and they wrap around the American ruling class to direct them in the direction where we are facing renewed warfare. In fact, we are at the precipice. If this goes wrong through miscalculation, misinformation, and a lot of blustering that is going on in Washington and in the other capitals of Europe, that it could escalate into a nuclear war between NATO, the United States on the one side, and Russia on the other side, both nuclear-armed country. We are in the third year of the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, and the question is whether this war will be brought to an end through a negotiated settlement, a peace agreement, or it will go forward till the end with the Russian forces basically going into Kiev, and finally the Ukrainian regime that had been put together by the Western powers surrenders. And on the other side is the other thread is the Israeli thread, and the agenda of the Israeli lobby that began again in the Woodrow Wilson years with the support of the Balfour Declaration and taking America to war in 1917 across the Atlantic into European affairs, from which the founding fathers were very clear not to get entangled with. But that entanglement has led to America becoming what you described quite rightly, the transition of America from a republic to an empire. America is the successor empire to the Anglo Empire, the British Empire, after 1945 to where we are. And that thread, the Israeli thread, the Jewish thread, goes through again many granular details and shifts and movements, but it is now very clear where it has arrived at. It is the agenda not only of the security of the Israeli state, but again, at its very inception, that is, it was not simply the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, the Palestine Mandate after World War I, that was under the British rule, British Empire, and nurtured by the British and the British Empire, but what remained hidden until it has now completely become clear what their agenda is. The agenda is Eretz Israel, or Greater Israel, the Israel between the rivers Nile and the river Euphrates in Iraq. And so expansionism. So on the one side is pushing the forces against the Russian Empire and then the Russian state after the collapse of the Soviet Union, pushing that to its edge so that there can be regime change brought about in Moscow and a division, partition of Russia, and the pillage and plunder of Russian resources by the imperialist interests of the Anglo-American Empire, a war that has its origin going back into the early 19th century. And then through various phases, it has come out to where we are. And so to connect those two things, and as I say, it is the double helium. And all we can do, given the limitation of our own time frame on this matter, is pull together the connections by some of the leading developments that take place in the period of the second half of the 20th century, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the situation we arrive at where we are at this moment in time. So if that is okay with you, then we can proceed.
That's fine by me.
Yeah, okay. So since I say there are two threads over here, like a double helix, let's look at the first thread, which is Russia. You know, and it is the confrontation with Russia that has become most dangerous. In terms of the conflict that is going on in Ukraine, but its gestation, its origin, has to be looked into in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Christmas week of 1991. But before I uh, go into that phase, I want to read into this discussion a few things that goes way back to that early years of the 20th century, leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and then the subsequent civil war in Russia between the Reds, that is the Bolsheviks, and the White Russians, that is the non-Bolshevik, the opponents of Bolshevism, that is the Russian people, the Russian army that was still in some ways loyal uh, to the empire or to the idea of what the empire represented after the overthrow of the Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II, and the brutal massacre of the Tsar's family by the Bolsheviks. So I think this is extremely important because the question is, who were the Bolsheviks, And the Bolsheviks were primarily Russian Jews and Jews from the Pale of Settlement. They were the intellectuals. They were the leaders of this movement, which was Marxist in its origin, Marxism, that became the Communist Party of Soviet Union. But in that critical period of time, they were known as the Bolshevik, that is the minority party, in opposition to the Mensheviks, who were also socialists. And among them, there were a lot of Jews also. But the Mensheviks were reformers, parliamentarians, and was led by a man named Alexander Kerensky, and he came to take power in 1917 March and establish a sort of a parliamentary government. But that was overthrown by a coup d'etat in October 1917. According to the Russian calendar, it changed. It was November 1917, and that Bolshevik revolution was led by under the leadership of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, which was predominantly Russian Jews from the Pale of Settlement. And so I just quickly want to read you because this is a very handy and uh, appropriate reference to put it in context. It is written by Winston Churchill, and it was published in the British paper, Illustrated Sunday Herald, in February 1920. I'm holding the original PDF of the paper, and it's a pretty long discussion. The title of it is called "Zionism versus Bolshevism: A Struggle for the Soul of the Jewish People," and this is in the middle of this. Um, Churchill makes a differentiation between national Jews, Jews who are living in various countries around Europe and in America, and who are devoted to the politics and the loyalty to the states in which they are residents as citizens. And then, in contrast to them, he then describes those who oppose them. They're the international Jews, and the third category that he puts forward, because this category has now come into play after 1917, are the Zionists. But I want to read to you just one
Well,
paragraph.
he also labels terrorist Jews. He's got the
Terrorist,
national Jews,
yeah,
international Jews, and terrorist Jews.
right, precisely. And the terrorist Jews are together with, I mean, it's a long discussion because there he names name. Uh, but let me quickly read this, and you might want to pick up from what I sent you, the terrorist Jews, if you want to read that paragraph. So I begin. International Jews. In violent opposition to all the sphere of Jewish effort rises the scheme of international Jews. The adherents of this sinister conspiracy are mostly men reared up among the unhappy population of countries where Jews are persecuted on account of their race. Most, if not all, of them have forsaken the faith of their forefathers and divorced from their minds all spiritual hopes of the next world. This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Spartacus and Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx, so Spartacus, we're going all the way back to the Roman times, and down to Trotsky, that's Russia, Bela Kun, that's Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg, Germany, and Emma Goldman, United States. This worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century. And now, at last, this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people by the hair of their heads and have become practically the undisputed masters of that enormous empire.
That's fascinating. You sent that to me just an hour ago. I quickly read it, and I was flabbergasted because everything we've been talking about in the first two videos on neoconservatism has been played out over 100 years ago by Winston Churchill and others, of course, but this is from Winston Churchill. And people should pick this up. Now, I don't know where you found it, but sort of an
It was
archive.
my, it was a bookmark in my.
Archive. I see it here on archive.org,
That's right.
Illustrated Sunday Herald, February 8th, 1920. And it is titled, maybe people can search for it, Zionism versus Bolshevism, Struggle for the Soul of the Jewish People by the Right Honorable Winston S. Churchill. So please look that up. It's fascinating.
Do you want to read terrorist Jews? That's one paragraph.
No. I'll leave that
No,
to others to
no.
pick up on.
Fair enough, because he's exactly pointing out in the Bolshevism, the Bolshevik Party is the terrorist Jews party in effect, and it
Yeah,
was.
and to be clear, and I think it does need mentioning, that Churchill is not lumping everybody in together. These are labels, and people are fluid, and people are different. So, like when he says Jews, and then he quite clearly points out that these Bolsheviks, most of them are atheists. So it doesn't have anything to do with religion necessarily. It has to do with culture. and how people were brought up and in what kind of an atmosphere they were brought up and whether they were persecuted for being part of this collective or not. It's a very fuzzy-edged definition. So people shouldn't just pounce on Jews. Oh, the Jews are the problem. No. As Churchill points out, it's not the Jews per se. It was the Bolshevik Jews. And then he goes on to talk in favorable terms about the establishment, yet to be seen for another 28 years, of a state of Israel. So it's a complex matter, and people shouldn't just simply take labels and run with them willy-nilly without looking at the broader context of how they are used in the time that they were quoted.
All of that is pertinent and relevant. But again, the context, and here is Churchill himself expressing it, and that's been discussed by many others, and I have discussed it by referring to many other writers, including leading Jewish writers, people like Edwin Montagu and others. So just to uh, put into perspective what Churchill does, he's writing at the time when this is all in the genesis. I mean, remember, 1920, there is no Jewish state, there is no Israel. The issue has just erupted. It's only 3 years after the Balfour Declaration, and the World War I has ended in 1918, and here it is in 1920, and in a tremendous speed. The world is changing phenomenally. I mean, the 1917 revolution is as great in its consequences as was the French Revolution in 1789, you might say. The American Revolution was contained within the North American hemisphere. You know, it did not spread outward. It was a revolution in the making of the American Republic. But the French Revolution had a European effect, you know, carried out then in terms of conquests and wars through Napoleon and so on and so forth. And then the European war against Russia, you know, that happened with Napoleon. And so where the Jews are concerned, you know, in this particular uh, discussion and reference that Churchill is making, and he repeats it uh, over and over again. This is about European Jews. That's what we're talking, isn't it? It's not about Jews from the Arab world, Jews from India, Jews from Africa, and so on and so forth, because the Jews were scattered around the world, and there are different threads of it. So the Central European Jews, um, and they were part of the discussion that emerged after the French Revolution, you know, the whole discussion of nations, nationalities, and individual rights, and so on and so forth. So the international Jews, and then the terrorist Jews that he defines, are that segment of the Jews who have become secularized, who are in so many different ways become the leaders of a secular movement that is atheistic. He calls them out, atheistical Jews. And so the Zionists, I mean, Herzl was an atheist, you know.
Yes.
Marx was an atheist. The leaders of the Bolshevik Party, they were Jews, as you correctly say, they were cultural Jews. That means they were born of Jewish background. But as Churchill says, I'm just requoting him, they have forsaken the faith of their forefathers and divorced from their minds all spiritual hopes of the next world. So these are the radical globalist, internationalist Jews that we can trace back to Marx and even before Marx, who turned away and sought assimilation, but became radical. And in the case of Russia and then Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Party had a predominance, as Churchill says, representation of Jews, the atheist Jews, the international Jews, the terrorist Jews, over the Russian membership that was Russian. As Churchill says, pure Russian, people like Bukharin and Chicherin and others. So yes, we have to keep this thing in mind. And there's going to be an inner conflict among the Jewish people, right? Where the inner conflict would be played out in Europe as it would be played out in America, and the consequences then will be both in Russia and in the Middle East. That's what we need to keep in mind. But the interesting part, again, I read that piece into the record. The other interesting part of it is who were the Jews in America who supported the Bolsheviks? They were, again, not people from the middle class or lower middle class. They were the magnates. They were the oligarchs. They were the leaders of the Wall Street. Because the Jews, especially the money class of Jews, were in the finance and banking sector predominantly, you know. And so they came from Europe and they established the same thing in America. They became, over time, the leaders of the financial and banking segment. And so I just want to read in because um, I'm reading from Professor Anthony C. Sutton's book on this subject, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. And he provides from the documentation, the names from people in the Wall Street, the financiers and others who were behind the Bolshevik before 1917. And they provided the money, they provided the funds, and they provided the support from America for the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. And so just let me read you a few names with the paragraph. There's a whole chapter here with the paragraph that is relevant. Sutton writes, probably the most superficially damning collection of documents on the Jewish conspiracy is in the State Department decimal file, and he gives the reference. The central document is one entitled Bolshevism and Judaism, dated November 13, 1918. The text is in the form of a report which states that the revolution in Russia was engineered in February 1916, and it was found that the following persons and firms were engaged in this destructive work. And so he gives the name. Jacob Schiff, who was one of the richest Jews in New York, Loeb, Kuhn and Company, Kuhn, Kuhn. Felix Warburg, a banker, Wall Street again. Otto Kahn, Mortimer Schiff, the son of Jacob Schiff. Jerome J. Hanover, Guggenheim, Max Brayton, Isaac Seligman, and among them John knows is J.P. Morgan's family and the Rockefeller family. And here is a quote from that report. Jacob Schiff, in fact, made a public announcement, and it was due to his financial influence that the Russian Revolution was successfully accomplished. And in the spring 1917, Jacob Schiff started to finance Trotsky, a Jew, for the purposes of accomplishing a social revolution in Russia. Okay, so again, there was deep involvement of American capital, but it was spearheaded by the Jewish financiers and Jewish bankers through many organizations. One of them was the American Red Cross to fund the Bolsheviks. And their agenda was very clear that with the overthrow of the Tsar, the establishment of a revolutionary government, and the revolution would be of a global nature, that Russia would be open to investment, and following the investment, the Russian resources would then be available to the Anglo-American Empire. And before I get back to the 1990s, one final point I want to make. Again, read it into the record that the whole globalist agenda that has come to the forefront in this period over the last dozen years and more. And of course, it became the focus during the COVID pandemic. Um, and the global migration policies and so on run out of Davos, the World Economic Forum. This agenda, again, is the culmination of what began right there, right in the period leading up to the Russian Revolution, end of World War I, the making of the League of Nations, and American foreign policy um, to be the spearhead of a worldwide one world government. And who articulates this? I just want to again read it on the record. David Rockefeller, the grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the founder of the Rockefeller empire, financial empire. And this is what David Rockefeller writes. Just one paragraph, just to put this matter into record. He writes, this is in his memoir. He's a proud internationalist, and he says, for more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents such as my encounter with Castro to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it. So, just on the record, these were not isolated issues and isolated thinking, you know. So you can see that the agenda of the Bolshevik, one part of the Bolshevik, or one part of the Bolshevik leadership, including Lenin, was for a world revolution. And the spark was the spark in Russia, you know, that would then spread into rest of Europe, rest of Europe that had become exhausted and were on their literally on their knees, you know, after 4 years of a savage war that had eliminated the cream of the European population, you know, the young men that we now remember wearing the poppies, you know, the poppy field. But this was the instrument that has been the dream of the oligarchs and others, that there will be one capital and they will rule the world, the Illuminati and so on. And that these people have no nation state loyalty and fidelity. They're internationalists, you know, they are cosmopolitan. And again, you have that thing coming together with the larger context of the Jews in European history as having no state of their own. And so the Zionists were the ones who wanted a state of their own. But the others were, you know, cosmopolitan. They had no state of their own, and so they wanted to join forces to establish some sort of a one world government. Okay, so there we are. That's the origin. That's the background. And so we now come to the period, the 1980s and 1990s. And what has happened? What has happened is these people who supported the Bolshevik Revolution, they're still there. Their children and grandchildren are now in American politics, as we have discussed. You know, they were the red diaper babies. They came of age in the period after the Second World War, during the Vietnam War. And they are the ones who are, in that sense, Trotskyites. They are on the left, but some of them shifted to the Republican Party. And that's why, the origin coming from the left, joining the Republican Party at the end of the Vietnam War, with their own concerns about what would be their position and what would be the relationship, not only with the Soviet Union at that time, but with Israel, which is the second thread that I'll come back to after this one. And so those things are converging. And so they saw that it is in the Republican Party that they could join to push forward their ideology, their idea that would find its fullest expression in PNAC, the Project for the New American Century. What happened was that as we look back on the scene, it is in the Reagan administration, the rearming started, the Star War decision, and the buildup, and the Soviet Union could not keep pace with it. But Soviet Union received a huge payback or a defeat in Afghanistan, which internally rocked the Soviet Union. There was a change of leadership. The old leadership either stepped down or died. That is, people around Brezhnev and Kosygin were replaced eventually by Gorbachev during the Reagan period. And Gorbachev, in the face of the rise of defense expenditure in Reagan's America, the Star Wars initiative, and then the tremendous military and political setback with the defeat of the Russian forces, of the Soviet forces in Afghanistan after their intervention there in 1979, that is, Gorbachev decided to pull back and introduced his policy of perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika, the restructuring of the Soviet economy, the opening up of the Soviet economy to the rest of the world, particularly to the Western capital, and glasnost, again, relaxing the Cold War and allowing some sort of a democratic development to take place within the Soviet Union. That led or precipitated within the Soviet Empire, that is the Warsaw Pact countries. Europe had been divided since the end of the Second World War. An uprising. There had been uprisings before, the Czech Spring, that took place in 1969, but was crushed by the Soviet tanks, or the 1956 Hungarian uprising, again for democratic purposes, for a little more freedom, was again crushed by the Soviet tanks. But then the uprising that began in the late 70s and spread into the 1980s was the Polish solidarity movement, and that was not crushed. And by the time the 80s are coming to an end, the big shocking blow to the Warsaw Pact and to Moscow was the tearing down by the German people, particularly in East Germany, of the Berlin Wall, 1989. And again, I mean, the Soviet army was present in East Germany. East Germany was a member state of the Warsaw Pact country. It was a communist state. Gorbachev did not allow for intervention. And the tearing down of the Berlin Wall in that sense, at the end of 1989, November 1989, if I remember correctly, that was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, the unification of Germany that it precipitated. And in less than 2 years, Soviet Union became history. It collapsed, you know. What happens next? Well, with the collapse of the Soviet Union came the end of the Warsaw Pact countries. But in these 2 years, there was negotiation going on between Washington and its European allies, that is, West Germany, France, and Britain, the leaders of those countries, with Gorbachev. And what was the discussion about? Oh, peaceful reunification of Germany and guarantees needed for that peaceful unification. What were the guarantees needed? That the Soviet army would not intervene, the Warsaw Pact country would not intervene. And from the Moscow's perspective, from Gorbachev's perspective, that the non-intervention, in fact, the peaceful unification of Germany must be guaranteed that the West would not intervene, And so Gorbachev would withdraw, would not give permission to the East German communists to repress, and the beginning of the unwinding taking place. But Gorbachev did not expect that Soviet Union itself would collapse as a result of all of this. Because what happened in this intervening years as Gorbachev was negotiating the withdrawal and received the assurances of the Western leaders at that time, in 1989, George Bush had succeeded, George Herbert Walker Bush had succeeded Ronald Reagan following the 1988 election. In France, we had the socialist president, Francois Mitterrand. In Germany, West Germany, or Federal Republic of Germany, you had the chancellor, conservative chancellor Helmut Kohl, and you had in Great Britain the prime minister Margaret Thatcher, who was then subsequently replaced in 1990, 1991 by John Major. So you had all of these European leaders, along with President Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, repeatedly giving assurances to Gorbachev that the unification of Germany, and if, as a result of the unification of Germany, Germany allows NATO forces to be placed in East Germany, that would be basically a German decision, where it would not be a NATO advancement eastward, even by 1 centimeter, as the language went, eastward towards Soviet Union at that time, and then, of course, Russia. And Gorbachev, as we now know, as has been talked about, as we have seen the archive reports that is held by Georgetown University from that period, took all of these promises and assurances that was given to him verbally with a handshake as a gentleman's agreement. When recently the Russian ambassador Sergei Lavrov was asked about this by none other than the people that some of us have been following on the alternate media, that is Judge Andrew Napolitano, who was recently in Russia, in Moscow for a week. That was about 2 weeks ago, and had a several-hour one-on-one conversation with Sergei Lavrov in the company of Larry Johnson. Sergei Lavrov said that we accepted the gentleman's agreement, that the promises that were given would be fulfilled. And Gorbachev did not seek a written documentation of that. Well, we now know in hindsight that that was an egregious error on the part of Gorbachev. And according to reports from Russia, Gorbachev has been vilified for that. Gorbachev is dead and gone, but he has been vilified that all of that subsequently happened was Gorbachev failure to what Ronald Reagan had talked about, trust but verify. Gorbachev took it as a gentleman's agreement. And so what then subsequently follows, was the internal shakeup in Russia as a result of the domino effect of the fall of Berlin Wall, the successful movement in Poland, the solidarity movement with worldwide support for it, a Roman, a Catholic Pope for the first time in over 400 years being elected in the conclave was from Poland, a Polish Pope, John Paul II, or his own name, Cardinal Wojtyla, Karol Wojtyla, and the tremendous support that this Catholic Pope was able to mobilize for the solidarity movement. So all of this ricocheted domestically within what remained of the Soviet Union at that time, and there was a revolution in which Gorbachev was removed by Boris Yeltsin, and which George Kennan, one of the leading Soviet experts, and in more ways than we can recall, the godfather of the containment strategy that had defined American foreign policy from 1946, 47 till the fall of the Soviet Union, was George Kennan was the architect of that. And George Kennan was alive, and George Kennan said that this has been the greatest peaceful revolution in modern history. Of course, the reflection of the peaceful revolution takes us back to the French Revolution, which was very bloody, and the guillotines, the mobs, the conflict that was not only limited to France, but that spread beyond France. And everything was opposite in the case of Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the revolution that took place that brought Boris Yeltsin to power. And also given the Russian history from 1917, which had been very violent, very bloody, and a civil war that went for about 8-9 years after 1917. And as I pointed out, the Americans were participant in that by supporting the Bolsheviks. So none of that happened in 1991, on that Christmas Eve revolution in the Soviet Union. And Boris Yeltsin came to power. And then began the whole phase. In the 1992 election, George Bush II George Bush I was defeated by the Democrat Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, in coming to power, fell into the position of going along with the neocon position, even though many of the neocons who were there in the Bush administration and in the the Reagan administration and then the Bush administration, people like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Feet, and others, were not carried over into the Bill Clinton administration. And so they withdrew and made a think tank housed in the same building with the American Enterprise Institute, the think tank being the Project for the New American Century, in which the document that you have been pointing out to, Rebuilding America's Defenses, they wrote and they published in September 2000. But in the last few months of the Bush administration, Paul Wolfowitz, who was at that time the Undersecretary of Defense, prepared for Dick Cheney. Dick Cheney was the Secretary of Defense for President Bush, prepared for what was called the draft called Defense Planning Guidance. And the Defense Planning Guidance 1992 that was given to Dick Cheney before that administration came to an end was the germ of the idea that later on was expanded in the document that you have read from, Rebuilding America's Defenses. Um, and there were three major points that this then extended at length in this September 2000 paper document. And the three major points are from the executive summary of defense planning guidance is one, the number one objective of US post-Cold War political and military strategy should be preventing the emergence of a rival superpower. Well, the rival superpower was Soviet Union that had collapsed during the Bush administration. And so now that becomes the number one policy. There should never be allowed to be another rival superpower that Soviet Union became after the end of World War II. By the way, nobody talks about it in 1991, 92. The Soviet Union was an ally that had defeated Germany in 1945, and at the cost of 27, 28 million dead, And it is without the Soviet Union, the Americans would have had to face that sort of numbers, and it was the Soviet body bags that allowed the Americans and the Allied powers to claim victory. But all of that has been censored and brushed aside. So again, you can see the noble lie coming through. The number two point of the defense planning guidance is another major U.S. objective should be to safeguard U.S. interests and promote American values. Now, this would be expanded to what you have in your in our second conversation you went into in great length, that America will have a constabulary force. That means America will provide the police force around the world, and the architecture of that police force, the World Constabulary, is the 800 plus bases around the world, especially those which are concentrated in the key points of the world where the resources are. One surrounding the Soviet Union at that point in time, one surrounding the Middle East, one surrounding Taiwan and China, and so on. So there.
Now, Salim, before you continue on that point, though, I just want to make one
Yeah.
bring up a point, and that is that sometimes it's easy to confuse the intellectual neoconservatives and their goal of promoting democracy, Trotskyism around the world, and American hawks. People, we see them in Trump's administration now. They're not necessarily neoconservative, and they haven't taken up the agenda of the neocons of the 1990s and 2000s. Instead, they look at what you just said, American interests. Because of the neocons, America now has interests, mostly economic, but also military, throughout the world. And these hawks take up that mantra of it's in our interest to promote these belligerent type of actions and to have these bases where normally you would not have bases. But that doesn't necessarily make them neocons. I think that people should probably look at the individuals and say, okay, is this person a neocon because he's pro-Ukraine, or is he looking after American interests? It can be a muddied waters.
Well, Well, your point is well taken, but it needs to be clarified. The neocons are, as we have established through the literature, the core group of neocons, the people who wrote the documents that you have the list of them, are primarily American Jews.
Yes.
They are, again, to repeat myself, to refresh it, going back to the first decade leading up to World War I and then the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. They are the immigrants from Eastern Europe, right? And those who had come earlier, like Jacob Schiff. If you might remember the day Jacob Schiff came to America in the period just before the Civil War. And so there were people who were here during the Civil War or before the Civil War. But it is the huge wave of immigration that took place in the period 1880, 1914, when a moratorium was placed on immigration, the beginning of World War I. So 1880, 1941, that's a huge wave of immigration that took place. One segment of that wave was from Eastern Europe, and that segment of the wave from Eastern Europe were in majority Jews. They had the choice. Many had the choice, and Winston Churchill writes about that in that paper that I just read and you have read, to go to Palestine. And some did go to Palestine.
Well, the
But
nationalist Jews would be the ones who go to England or France or Germany or the
remain.
United States and say that we are American, but we practice the Jewish faith, or we're Jews in America, and they were nationalist Jews.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, during that time, 1880, 1918 or so, 2 million, and you mentioned it was a huge percentage, but it was 2 million East European Jews came to the United States. Some of them assimilated and became American Jews. Others kept these underlying hatred of the countries that they left and developed this neoconservative attitude.
Yeah, right. So, but the thing to differentiate, if you want to be very precise and not lump them, because that's what your concern is, and that's my concern. Whether we're talking about Jews or whether we're talking about Muslims or whether we're talking about Hindus or whether we're talking about Catholics, we have to have an instrument of analysis that doesn't lump everything together. You know,
Just on that point, let's go back to Churchill, and I'll quote from the paper you sent out, where he talks about national Jews. He says, "There can be no greater mistake than to attribute to each individual a recognizable share in the qualities which make up the national character. There are all sorts of men, good, bad, and, for the most part, indifferent in every country and in every race." So,
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. What has been my point throughout my academic career and my writing career, that the ultimate minority is the individual.
yes, absolutely. You're a classical liberal in that sense.
Yeah. So and Churchill, in a sense, is emphasizing that point if you're reading it through. But what he is also emphasizing that cannot be lost in this discussion or any discussion in the context of where we are today in Israel, in West Asia, or in Ukraine and in the war with Russia, is the Central European origin of that segment of Jews. Because again, we have talked about in our previous discussion, and we can refresh ourselves here in the context of this, that the largest body of ethnic immigrants from Europe were the Germans, or one of the largest bodies, apart from the Anglo-Saxon, the English, the Irish, the Scot, coming from that part of the world. But they were, in that sense, the Pilgrim Fathers, the Plymouth generation. But the next body of people, especially in the American states, colonies before became states, as in Pennsylvania, where Germans, I mean, and some of the leaders in the American army during both the First World War and, of course, in the Second World War were of German origin. Eisenhower, Nimitz, and people like them were of German origin, and they fought against Germany. I mean, they were Americans. They had become Americans, you know. So we are talking about Eastern European Jews as opposed to Jews who were from Central Europe or from the Anglo-Saxon countries, including France. They were more or less national Jews, and the opposition to Zionism, which is the third branch that Churchill talks about, and he's writing in 1920. This is just the germinal stage of Zionism in terms of the popular appeal. The ideas are again coming out of the head of two or three people, just like the ideas of PNAC. They were also people from Central Europe, and the opposition to Zionism itself came from Jews who were from among the national Jews, from people from Germany, from Holland, from England, and so on and so forth. And we have mentioned name, and we have mentioned the organization, the American Jewish Council, and people like Elmer Berger and Judah Magnus, and the whole lot of them, you know. So the famous Rabbi Martin, Rabbi Buber, they were from Germany. They were the assimilated Jews. They were very proud of the German culture, just as Theodor Herzl himself. His mother was completely assimilated into German and, you know, taught her son German and were very proud of being German. And then the reversal that takes place after World War I in Germany, you know. So the Morgenthau's, Henry Morgenthau, who was the ambassador of Woodrow Wilson to the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople during World War I, Henry Morgenthau Jr., who served Franklin Roosevelt as the Secretary of Treasury through his four administration, you know. So these were the German Jews. These were the assimilated Jews, you know. So you might again go back to Churchill's definition, you know. Among the assimilated Jews are the national Jews. Then those are the Zionist Jews. But the Zionist Jews, he's asking them to support the British Empire. The British Empire, it is the British Empire project. Right in the paper, you know, it is there, the conquest of Palestine and so on and so forth. And so that's a different history. And then there is the international Jews, the terrorist Jews. And that's a very large segment of the Jewish population that has come to America. And the question that is so puzzling or surprising is, why would the national Jews, the American Jews, take the case of Jacob Schiff, take the case of Armand Hammer, who becomes the chairman and CEO of Occidental Petroleum, one of the biggest, largest petroleum company, and is totally devoted to the support of the Bolsheviks. You know, in the case of Jacob Schiff, he's a national Jew coming from Central Europe. But in the case of Armand Hammer, he is coming from either Belarus or Lithuania, his family. You know, so they're coming from the Pale of Settlement. And so there is this mix, you know, as Churchill refers to them, he refers to them as a race, the Jewish race. Today we don't talk in the language of race. Today we talk in the language of ethnicity and culture. So again, the language, the way it was seen, and so forth. So the point is that in the defense planning guidance, as from where we departed, the three critical points that are laid out, and then that is expanded in the PNAC document, is that America will not accept and tolerate a rival superpower. America not accepting a rival superpower is also Jewish interest. It's like a double helix, you know. Without Britain, there would be no Balfour Declaration, there would be no Palestine Mandate, there would be no partition of Palestine, and therefore there would be no establishment through the UN of a Jewish state. You know, and consequences follow from the original premise. But with the end of that is the making of the Jewish state, and the shift of interest of the Jews from Britain to America. Just as in that first half of the 20th century, they were tightly united, as Churchill describes them, as good Jews, the national Jews, the Zionist Jews, with the British Empire. They rode the British Empire to the establishment of a Jewish state. And then post 1945, or more precisely post 1948, which coincides with the re-election of or the election of Truman, because he was now running on his own after having served as a president, as a successor of Roosevelt, who died during his administration. So post 1945, 48, the Jews move. They turn their focus and their interest to America, because British Empire has come to an end, or coming to an end. And also, Britain itself becomes the special relationship with America. So we talk about Anglo-American interests, Anglo-American power, and so on. So it is all converging. But in 1917, or in that period of time, the idea of a Jewish state is not even in the spec of these people. It might be an idea. It might be a book that they have read by Theodor Herzl, but it is not yet in the play, except for the Balfour Declaration. So the number 2 point, they will not tolerate a rival to America. And number 2 point is again constabulary, to promote American values. Well, in the period of time that we are reading, this is from the 1990s to where we are now. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu goes around constantly reminding people who are listening to him, both American and Israelis, that American values and Israeli values are one and the same. So people have asked, if American values and Israeli values are the same, people like former Ambassador Charles Freedom, I don't recognize my American values, because in my American values there is no genocide and support for
Well,
genocide.
remember in our last video, I mentioned that throughout PNAC's article on rearming America, nowhere do they define what an American value is. It's left up to the reader to imbue that phrase, American values, with what they think it might be, so it can mean anything to anybody. They do mention democracy, but as we know that these people's democracy is in a sense of Trotskyism,
Yeah, okay.
anti-czarist, anti-monarchist, people, demo.
Absolutely. And it is purposely left fluid. It is just like when you move from defining uh, male and female in terms of biology, sex, to gender, then gender becomes a fluid concept. And one can wake up in the morning and say, I'm a woman, and then, you're transgender, and so on and so forth. So it is left to the subjective definition. And it is also, in that sense, Leo Strauss's methodology, that is the exoteric meaning. People read and they derive whatever meaning they want, that they can relate to, that is on the surface, that is literal. And then there is the esoteric meaning, the hidden meaning, that only the elect knows what they're talking about, and so it becomes a coded word. And so, what is the American value? Well, in the subsequent writings of the neocons, like Charles Krauthammer, it becomes democracy, democratic realism, the promotion of democracy, regime change, color revolution, and all of that come into being in this period. And the third vital point, if necessary, the United States must be prepared to take unilateral action. United States, the police force, United States, the pillar of what had become the post 1945 world order through the United Nations, international law. But you see, again, it is not defined, but now we know, as we look back at it, the proposition is, again, American exceptionalism, the chosen people, It is about rule-based order. We make the rule, we're going to implement it. Unilateral action. That is action no longer within the framework of international law as defined by the United Nations, the Charter, and all the various institutions and all the agreements and conventions and treaties that was, by the way, led by America. I mean, if you're talking about, and which we have to come in terms of the second thread about Israel, is the question of nuclear non-proliferation treaty. It was started by John F. Kennedy post-Cuban crisis as the negotiation began with Khrushchev, and it was consummated because he was assassinated in '63. But the idea of the non-proliferation treaty was seized upon and carried forward and consummated in 1968 when Johnson was still the president. I mean, it was open. The draft was made public. And then after Johnson, with the Nixon administration, it started being implemented. So here we are. All these things become relevant, and America, after the Cold War, is going to go in a different direction. That is what the promise is. That is what the policy is. So to wrap this up and then go into what happens in Europe is that for almost half a century after 1945, the world is bipolar, and the American strategy is containment, to contain Soviet Union. But to contain Soviet Union in terms of what? Insofar as the main text of the founding ideas of containment strategy takes place or is brought forward. It is Soviet Union is a communist regime. It is the ideology of communism that has to be contained. And in that context, every single conflict in which America was engaged in, either by itself because it did not have a coalition of the willing, or there was a coalition of the willing, that is, America's allies, or from the so-called free world, in a bipolar world. One was the free world, one was the communist world, this with the leadership of the Soviet Union. So beginning right from the Korean War through all the other wars that America has fought, the most destructive was the Vietnam War. In the Korean War, there was a coalition of the willing, the United Nations, and so Canada was there. It was fought under the United Nations flag. But in the Vietnam War, there was no United Nations. There was no declaration of war. It became a police action, so to speak. To contain Soviet Union or to contain communism.
The phrase at the time, I remember this clearly, it was the domino effect. If South Vietnam falls, that's a domino effect. And now you're talking about all of Southeast Asia becoming communist, and finally the world becomes communist.
That's right. That's it. The domino effect was the justification. So it's police action to contain it. They had failed. America, from its own perspective, as if it was America's failure, but that became the language. Who lost China? And the whole McCarthy period that erupted. Ironically, who lost China became the issue that led to the Korean War, because China had gone communist. Chiang Kai-shek was defeated. The nationalists were defeated, and they fled to Taiwan or Formosa, Taiwan, and a communist regime in mainland China came into being under the leadership of Mao Zedong. But what was the reverberation of that in terms of American politics and geopolitics? It was the expansion taking place, Soviet Union and now China. This is the heartland of Eurasia, gone communist. on the west, from Berlin on the west, the fear, the danger, the Iron Curtain coming down, that the Soviet Union would advance and could take over unless there is resistance, tripwire the rest of Europe. And here now you have on the east, onto the Pacific Ocean, mainland China falls. America was distracted, or America's commitment could not go to reverse the Chinese Revolution. But in the Korea, they fought to contain the further advancement and left Korea divided. That was Eisenhower's legacy, divided. Eisenhower brought about the ceasefire, ended it. Um, One may also recall that toward the end of the war, basically Japan had been defeated. Truman used the bomb. The message was to Soviet Union: we have the bomb. We can destroy you. And so there was a window of 4 years before Soviet Union got the bomb in 1949 to do the damage if America wanted. But the Japanese war ended with the display of the use of nuclear weapon. In the Korean War, that issue surfaced again, and General Douglas MacArthur was engaged with the American chiefs of staff and the Truman administration whether the bomb would be used to contain the Chinese in the Korean Peninsula. It led to a lot of infighting, disagreement, and finally Truman decided to fire Douglas MacArthur, and he was fired. And Truman's administration came to an end, and Eisenhower was elected. And the first task that Eisenhower took into hand was to, negotiate a ceasefire around the 37th parallel. So Vietnam becomes the next issue, and it is in this period the issue of Israel was sort of, eclipsed by this fight against communism, the containment of communism. And in 49, Who Lost China became the rallying cry of the right-wing Republican Party, led by Joe McCarthy, who even went on to accuse people like George Marshall, another five-star general, for being soft on communism, and so on and so forth. There were others in that whole list. And so that was a huge internal wound in American politics. But the point is that Vietnam is where the justification for the intervention by LBJ on a false basis, that is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There was no such Gulf of Tonkin incident, but that became the basis of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, authorizing or giving authorization to Johnson to go to war in Vietnam. So here you might take another thing into notice. It is the beginning. The Korean War was a UN declaration. It went through the UN. Uniting for Peace resolution, when there was a veto of the Soviet Union at the Security Council, it would move to the General Assembly under that specific resolution for Uniting for Peace, and then it had the authorization of the UN. But beginning with Vietnam, all the subsequent military actions that have taken place by America has not been declared by the Congress. Congress has the authority to declare war, not the president.
The last war that was declared by Congress technically was the Second World War.
Second World War.
Everything else has been authorized use of power.
Yes, yes. And so that's where we have come to, and that's again a thing that the neocons are sharpening. Unilateral action. So America doesn't have to go to the UN, unless America wants a coalition of the willing, which will become an issue with George Bush II, over the Iraq War, to get the UN authorization, but not going to the Congress for authorization. So this whole focus on the Soviet Union is now over. with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And what will be the next guiding principle as America drifts? Yeah. And that's where the PNAC document or its precursor, the document that was prepared for Dick Cheney to be used for discussion, the draft planning guidance, um, comes into play. And ultimately, the PNAC document, as Ray McGovern said of it uh, quite recently, that it becomes the Mein Kampf of the neocon, you know. And what is, in a sense, on the margin or on the sidebar now becomes, in a matter of a few years, the mainstream politics of America. So this leads to the whole issue of what was the backstory of ultimately the Ukraine war. The promises made by and guarantees given by the Western leaders, George Bush the first, and all his contemporaries in Europe, um, were set aside with the beginning of pushing NATO. The whole purpose of NATO, when it was founded in 1949, as the saying goes, was to keep Germany down, America in, and Soviet Union out of Europe. And so NATO would provide the tripwire in Europe against Soviet Union if Soviet Union uh, seeks to push forward westward to war. In effect, Soviet Union was contained by the politics and the military strategy of mutual assured destruction, nuclear weapons, and so on. And it was under the control of the Americans. The first signatory to that NATO treaty was, among the first signatory was France, General de Gaulle. But General de Gaulle had also other ideas. And General de Gaulle trusted people like Eisenhower, with whom he served during World War II. You know, Eisenhower was the supreme commander of Europe. He became the supreme commander of the NATO forces in Europe, the first supreme commander in 1949. And the headquarters was established outside of Paris. And de Gaulle was there, though de Gaulle was not the head of the state at that time. It was still the Fourth Republic. But de Gaulle trusted and had worked with people around Eisenhower. Both were military men, both were leaders of their own countries in the military forces. But by the time de Gaulle became the president in 1958 under the Fifth Republic, de Gaulle's idea was a united Europe, which is what he began with, joining hands with Konrad Adenauer of the Federal Republic of Germany. But his vision took him all the way to Russia, Russia of the Urals. So Europe was one from Urals to the Atlantic. And he became more and more disappointed after the assassination of President Kennedy. In fact, de Gaulle himself was a target because de Gaulle was supporting Kennedy on the question of nuclear non-proliferation, which was an issue with Ben Gurion's Israel, and the role of Israel is a third rail in American politics on this matter, and very few people want to discuss it. But coming to de Gaulle, he basically, his disillusionment led to withdrawing France from NATO and removing or pushing NATO's headquarters out of France. And it took 4 decades before France rejoined NATO under President Sarkozy in 2009, I think, 2007 or 2009. And once more, France became an active partner. So there was internal disagreements on the question of Russia. But now, with Warsaw Pact gone, what was the purpose of NATO? That was the question, you know.
That's what I'm asking myself today.
Exactly. And there was the other organization that had come into being on the shadows of the movement to make a European Union. And that was the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. And Russia was a member of that. And the whole argument was that there has to be a new architecture for security in Europe, which must be indivisible. And that was Russia's position. However, the Americans, the neocons, I mean, you're seeing that the whole idea of unilateralism and police force and worldwide constabulary and so on and so forth, were not in agreement with it, and they pushed for the advancement and they lured the East European countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact agreement, countries like Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia that's later on split into Czech Republic and Slovakian Republic, lured them with the promises of development, financing, and through the European Union to advance their goals of a democratic role to join the NATO, and they started joining. The critical member that joined NATO in 1999 was Poland, over the objection of Russia, because while Poland had been a Warsaw Pact member, Poland has been a historic rival or enemy of Russia. Deep memories of both World War One and World War Two, or in fact going all the way back to Napoleon. Poland was the gateway for the Europeans to go through to Russia. And so Poland's bitterness against Russia and Poland joining the NATO was a red flag for Moscow. And by the time Poland joined, a transition was taking place in Russia. Boris Yeltsin was stepping down, and Putin was coming forward as a successor to Boris Yeltsin. Boris
And
Yeltsin,
Putin apparently put all of these animosities historically behind him because he asked Clinton to join NATO too.
precisely.
And Clinton rejected it.
Precisely. So yeah, that is so very true because Putin, in so many ways, like Peter the Great in Russian history, is very Euro-oriented. He served in Germany. He speaks fluent German. He's immersed in German culture, and he is by training a lawyer, though he worked for the KGB. He is a law graduate from Moscow, and it is his legal mind. And so he brings that European orientation, European culture, European history, understanding of Europe. And yeah, I mean, for Putin, what we now see on a personal level and then on a historic level as a leader of Russia, what we see is that Putin is all about restoring the mother culture of Russia and eliminating all the aspect of the 70-year occupation, 70 plus years of occupation of Russia by the Bolsheviks. you know, the communists who are Bolsheviks, to wipe that out. So the restoration of the church and the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Patriarch in Moscow, and the return of all the values of Russia pre-1917 is to the credit of Putin. So instead of reciprocating that, the Europeans who joined, the East Europeans who joined NATO, were holding Putin and everybody else from the framework of their historic experience, which was pre-19 Tsarist Russia, as the leader of the Slavic people, and then the Bolshevik Revolution. So it's, again, which side of the telescope or microscope you're looking through in trying to frame the understanding of your own history, that becomes the huge problem. So in 1999, Poland joins, and the other countries, Estonia joins, which is one of the Baltic states, and then others will join. Lithuania and Latvia will join. And Putin in 2007, 2008, twice at the Munich conference in 2007 and then subsequently in 2008, he announced what he called his red line, which would be Ukraine, and no further advancement. That niet means niet. That's the red line, and that was conveyed to the Americans by the American ambassador in Moscow at that time, Bill Burns, who later on became the CIA director for Joe Biden administration. Was conveyed by Bill Burns to Condoleezza Rice, who was at that time the Secretary of State for George Bush II, or George Bush the Jr., that niet means niet. There should be no advancement. But the Republican Party leadership of both George Bush and then Senator John McCain, they were bent upon advancing NATO. And the argument was it is the right of a sovereign state to choose where they want to go. It is their sovereign right. It's the sovereign right of Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and in this case, Hungary. And that experiment was done by bringing in Georgia, or trying to bring in Georgia at that point in time by George Bush Jr. Through a color revolution. A color revolution was tried, color revolution leading to regime change was also tried in Ukraine in 2004. And President Yevtushenko was elected over the candidate who was running against him, Yanukovych, through the color revolution. So the advancement, the pushing NATO membership further and further towards the borderland, the frontier of Soviet Union, became the issue in the East-West politics throughout that first decade of the 21st century, culminating in 2014 under Obama's administration, led by Obama's people, what became known as the Maidan Revolution, or Maidan coup d'etat, in February 2014, where the elected president, the president who got elected, I think it was in the 2010 election, Yanukovych, and Yevtushenko was defeated. Ukraine is a divided country. The western part of Ukraine are basically people who are non-Russian speaking. They're either Hungarian or Galician or Ukrainian themselves, even though Ukrainian language is very close to the Russian language. But they are non-Russian people primarily. And then on the eastern part, east of the river Dnieper, are Ukrainians who are Russian people. This internal division was reflected in all this election until 2014, or rather 2010, when Yanukovych was elected. He carried the eastern part and parts of the western. In the previous election, it was the reverse. And in 2014 coup, Yanukovych was overthrown. And in his place, Poroshenko was put in his place, who had been defeated in the 2010 election by Victoria Nuland, a neocon, and supported by all the cast of character in Washington who were neocons, John
Did
McCain.
they
Uh,
not see the hypocrisy here when on the one hand they would say that Ukraine has a sovereign right to choose what kind of organization they want to belong to as regards NATO, and yet when they elect a pro-Russian president and people like Victoria Nuland don't like it, what happened to their sovereign right there? She goes in and has a regime change.
that's right.
And also Cuba. Does Cuba have a sovereign right to accept Soviet missiles on its soil? Not in, was it 1962? No, no sovereign rights existed then. Not that I'm a favor of Soviet Union or Cuba, but the
The
point is that they're hypocrites.
principle. We're talking about the principle.
Yeah, they're hypocrites.
Um, as so many people have pointed out, the sovereign right of Mexico to open up and bring in Soviet troops and now Russian troops or Chinese troops in Mexico would have no tolerance for that. In Washington, there would be immediate military action to remove those troops, as what happened in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Missiles being placed 90 miles from Florida, pointed at the heartland of America, and that was indeed that is the flip side of what happened with Ukraine, because pushing NATO all the way into Ukraine, that Ukraine has the sovereign right to decide on whether it joins NATO or not. To concede to that argument by Moscow would be to allow NATO to place weapon systems, including nuclear weapon systems, in Ukraine, just a few hundred miles from Moscow. And of course, Ukraine is a border state sharing something like 1,200 miles of border with the Russian Federation.
That's what Ukraine means, doesn't it? It means borderland. That's what the word means.
Exactly, exactly. And its origin lies going all the way back to Catherine the Great as a borderland country that was absorbed into Russian
You
Empire.
know, I have to smirk here because as we go into this history, we go to Catherine the Great, I'm reminded of Tucker Carlson's interview with Putin, where he wanted to know why Putin is in Ukraine, and Putin says, "Do you want to have a serious conversation?" And Tucker says yes. So then he goes back 600 years in history to do exactly what you're doing today, is trying to frame a context for immediate action, right? What's happening today in a context that you really have to sit down and take notice and take notes and study rather than be a knee-jerk reaction. Putin bad, he crossed the border. Ukraine has a sovereign right to join NATO if it wants to. These are so superficial that they should be dismissed, these kinds of arguments. Unless you get into the granular, into the nitty-gritty, into the weeds, as you say, in history, you can't understand these kinds of conflicts.
Well, narrative is built by removing history. Narrative then becomes simply a cut and paste history to serve the interests of whoever you are advocating for. It is not contextualized. It is not looked at from the angles of all the major participants in that particular issue, whether we're talking about India, Pakistan, whether we're talking about Russia and the rest of Europe, whether we're talking about China and Japan, and so on and so forth. Um, uh, there are participants in each of these, and one has to take account of all the participants and their understanding, rather than a cut and paste history to serve whoever you are advocating for as a diplomat or as a lawyer or particularly journalists, who become the mouthpiece of the power holders. Um, Absolutely. So we arrive at a point which is being the historical interest. I mean, if I stop here, and then is the war that comes around. If I stop here for the moment and just again put this in that wider framework, the wider framework is it goes all the way back to this repeated attempts by European powers, France, then Germany, France in the Napoleonic time, Germany in World War I, and then in World War II, and going further back, Great Britain as an empire with its crown jewel in India, trying to contain the Russian Empire with the Crimean War, and then the war or the Great Game from Afghanistan. All of these were done to not only put pressure on what is Russia, they saw Russia as their adversaries, and they also saw Russia as what ultimately this man who became, in a sense, the godfather of geostrategic thinking, Halford Mackinder. Halford Mackinder wrote this famous paper, which I'm holding in my hand, The Geographical Pivot of History. It was published in April 1904 in the journal called the Geographical Journal. And the whole idea is, in terms of geostrategic global strategy, is Mackinder's thesis that became the working hypothesis of all the great powers, beginning with Great Britain, that whoever controls the Eurasian landmass will eventually control the rimlands and therefore the world. The Eurasian landmass stretches from the Pacific to the boundaries of Russia with Europe. That is the Eurasian landmass. So what is there? Russian Empire from the Baltics to the Pacific, China, and then on the south is India. This is the Eurasian landmass. What are the rimlands? The island states, particularly the Americas on the one side, the Australia on the other side, the East Indies, and so on. These are the rimland, the island states. So whoever controls or come to control the Eurasian landmass will ultimately be the hegemon, the unipolar power in the world. And the price for that is, of course, the tremendous wealth that was estimated that the Eurasian landmass hold in terms of minerals and lumber and water and so on and so forth. And with the discovery of oil at the end of the 19th century in the Persian Gulf region and in the Caspian Sea area, oil becomes, of course, then the black gold of the modern industrial age. And this has been the driving force. So among the neocons, I mean, as we pointed out, the core group is the Jews from the Pale of Settlement. And for them, driving and focusing on Russia as they did at the time, at the turn of the last century, early 20th century, and the revolution that came, they were not only taking their own baggage of history and taking revenge upon Tsarist Russia by supporting the revolution, they had a profound sense of what would be the market and the resources of Eurasian landmass if they come to control that. They'd already opened China in the 19th century, the open door policy, and India had become the crown jewel of the British Empire in the 19th century, 18th, 19th century. So all that was left in terms of Mackinder's theory was the Eurasian landmass, which is Russia. China was open door. China then had its sort of a Republican revolution with Dr. Sun Yat-sen in 1911, and his successor was Chiang Kai-shek, that is the nationalist, that is whom the Americans and the British supported in that early part of the 20th century till the Chinese Revolution succeeded in 1949. And then they supported the Bolsheviks to take over Russia. And though once the Bolsheviks succeeded and the counter-revolution was defeated and Bolshevik came to power, many of the Americans withdrew. Not all of them, many of them withdrew because Trotsky was defeated by Stalin, and the whole idea of the one world revolution, in a sense, got smothered or suffocated by the defeat of Trotsky in the rivalry between Trotsky and Stalin after Lenin's death in 1924. And Stalin turned upside down the whole idea of Soviet Union being part of the world revolution into what became Stalin's agenda, socialism in one country. And that withdrawal left Soviet Union isolated because Soviet Union was not recognized by America. There was no diplomatic exchange until Roosevelt's election and inauguration in 1933, when Roosevelt turn around and recognize Soviet Union and establish embassy and so on and so forth. And Roosevelt's idea through the war, Second World War, and his meetings with Stalin and the private discussions and public discussions, which are now all on the record available, was, just to recapitulate it, completely different from what happened after he died, because he saw a partnership between United States and Soviet Union. Again, the business interests were there. Again, the left-wing Jews were there with him. Their target became Germany, to deindustrialize Germany. That was the Morgenthau Plan. And Roosevelt's idea was that with Washington and Moscow and Britain, ironically, as a junior partner, they will form the condominium in terms of global politics through the United Nations. And that's how Roosevelt extended the offer to Stalin to become the member of or to become one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council with the veto power. That was extended to China. China was already in relationship with America. And Britain and France. France was being resurrected and brought back. France had been taken over by Hitler in 1940. So France was brought back, and so Britain, France, China, United States, and Soviet Union becomes a 5-member, but the actual power would be United States and Soviet Union. And so the collaboration and the role that these two would play in having the structure of international law and so on and so forth. And Stalin went along with that and agreed with that and became a member. The Soviet Union was not a member of League of Nations, so he came into the United Nations. But then all of that got derailed with the Truman administration, and it was again Churchill's goading and prodding that Soviet Union became the enemy. So that phase ended in 1991. The expansion of NATO was not brought about as was proposed by the leadership at that time in the West, including George Bush and James Baker, to end the NATO, not to advance eastward. Just the opposite happened. And so we come to 2014, a coup d'etat. Yevtushenko is removed, Poroshenko is brought back, and Poroshenko and the people around him, the Ukrainian nationalists who had been there all the time, from going all the way back to the Bolshevik Revolution, these nationalists were fascists. They participated during the what the Russian today call, or what the Soviet Union called, the Great Patriotic War, that is a war against Nazi Germany between 1941 and 45, the Ukrainian nationalists, led by people like Stephen Bandera, were allies of, party with the Nazi forces, and engage in the brutalities and the extermination of minorities and Jews in Ukraine and in western parts of Russia, including Poland. That's the irony. And it is these people who surrounded Poroshenko, who were financed and supported by the Americans and the EU members, including Canada. And of course, our deputy prime minister under Justin Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, her grandfather was a member of the Goebbels party in that part of the world. And suddenly we find, but it is not so sudden if we again go into the granular details, that when World War II ended, the Americans the Allied power brought out Nazi leaders, German leaders, fascist forces leaders out of Eastern Europe, and gave them residency in America, in Canada, in Australia, in South America, and in South Africa. And that's how Chrystia Freeland's family ended up in Canada, in western part of Canada, in Alberta. And they fostered them and trained them. And this is the making of what the Ukraine nationalists, the Azov Brigade, the Azov Battalion, and all of those, what, for lack of a better word, we can call the Ukro-Nazis. And their whole agenda became to evict and exterminate the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine, which is east of the river Dnieper, particularly what is now called the Donbass region. And that accelerated. That has been written off from the Western history about the recent war in Ukraine, that the war did not begin in Ukraine on February 2022, when Putin approved and launched the special military operation in the Donbass region. It began even earlier than 2014, culminated with the coup d'etat that overthrew Yevtushenko, brought into power Poroshenko. Then with the election in 2019, Zelensky was elected. His whole agenda was quote unquote peace. But again, the noble lie, peace was no peace. Peace would be on their term. But he was part of this whole movement that was taking place through NATO and European Union under American leadership to engage with the Soviet Union and bring about regime change in Moscow. So that is the context. In this whole operation, there is that Jewish element, very significant Jewish element. People like Victoria Nuland and her husband, Robert Kagan, who are all present in PNAC documentation. But there are also a number of very important non-Jews who come from Eastern Europe. And the singularly most important person in that list is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is Polish-American. Actually, his father served in Canada as a Polish ambassador. So I believe Zbigniew Brzezinski had a Canadian connection growing up in Canada. And then moving on to America, where he ended up. He was a professor at Columbia University, but then ended up as the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter. So he's the counterpart of Henry Kissinger, but a non-Jew, in this whole exercise of the one world policy, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, the World Economic Forum. And his thinking, his policy of using Ukraine as a battering ram to undo Russia and to divide up Russia and use Russian resources. And so here we are. 3 years later, the war continues, the war in which the Biden administration was in office when the SMO began. And by the way, the SMO is technically within the United Nations Charter through R2P,
Responsibility to protect, yes.
yeah. And the Canadian contribution in the making of R2P, which then becomes part of, which happened, the development took place after the Rwanda
Mm.
genocide, and Canada heavily contributed to that, just as Canada contributed heavily to the making of the Rome Statute, which led to the establishment of the International Criminal Court. And the very first president of the panel of judges, 18 individual judges to the International Criminal Court, the very first president of that panel of judges was a Canadian who helped draft the Rome Statute under the authority of Jean Chrétien and his foreign minister, Lloyd Axford. His name is Philip Kirsch, who served in the Department of Foreign Affairs at that time in its legal branch, and then ended up being the judge of the ICC. So Canada has played a very significant role in these matters, and yet the Canadian government has gone in a totally different direction. Because the question to be asked, what was the interest of Canada to be involved in the Ukraine war and to, contribute through money, through soldiers being sent or officers being sent to Ukraine, and through equipment that was supplied to Ukraine. What was Canada's national interest? This has never been defined, but we did that according to the government, on the basis that we are a NATO member, and this was a NATO operation. But there are
Ukraine, I have to remind people, is not a NATO country.
not a NATO member, exactly, exactly. And there were other NATO members who refused to participate in that.
Yes.
Particularly Turkey, which is the most important NATO member on the eastern bloc of countries in Europe, and the guardian of the Black Sea, or Hungary for that matter, under
Now, I
Viktor.
think that Canada's involvement stems primarily, and you would know more about this, two things. Chrystia Freeland, who studied in Ukraine, in Kiev, when it was part of the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
and who was visited by the KGB and has personal animus towards Russia. And secondly, Justin Trudeau, who's an ineffectual, was an ineffectual prime minister who simply wanted to go along with those huge, powerful decision makers in the WEF, in NATO, in the United States, and he was led along in that direction. So that's our interest. Our interest, we have no interest in Ukraine.
Absolutely. And I would cap it up by saying, once again, we displayed, Ottawa displayed the nature of Canada as a vassal state. We have been
Yes.
a vassal state of Britain, Great Britain, right from its foundation. And then after 1945, we become the vassal state of the United States. And in the recent years, under Stephen Harper and then Justin Trudeau, we gladly became the vassal state of the WEF. A whole lot of them in Ottawa are all members of the WEF, young global leaders, and so on and so forth. And it is also surrounded by the noble lie. We as a member of the NATO are participating in the collective security arrangement of democratic states, when Ukraine has very little of democracy to broadcast, and the role that people like Poroshenko and then Zelensky has played in crushing. If Ukraine is, in that sense, a multi-ethnic state or a multicultural state, the division between Russian-speaking people and non-Russian-speaking people, and therefore people belonging to different uh, um, segments of Christianity. I mean, the Russian-speaking people are all Orthodox Christians, you know, and the non-Russian speaking people, especially those closer and closer to Poland, are Catholics, and so that division. We pride ourselves to be multicultural, and so that's our contribution, so to speak, in terms of global politics as a multicultural society. But we have no respect for multiculturalism in other places, especially what we see in in Ukraine under both Poroshenko and uh, Zelensky, the coordinated and orchestrated attacks on the Orthodox Church, that has taken place, the imprisonment of people, the torture and murder of non-Ukrainians reporting from there, including Americans such as Gonzalo Lira, who was captured and killed by Ukrainian leaders under Biden administration, and so it is really highly questionable of what has happened in terms of Canada's place and how Canada has conducted itself, with finally topping everything is bringing into the House of Commons a member of the the Bandera group from the Second World War period, who was a member of the Waffen SS. Uh,
Uncle.
um, Hunka. That was in 2023, in the company of Zelensky and all the 338 members standing and saluting him as a Canadian hero. That our heroes are members of the Waffen SS, the ultimate disgrace. And yet, the Canadian media and none of the Canadian opposition leaders, or even the public intellectuals, apart from people like you and me, spoke out against it. It is it, it is a reflection of what has happened in terms of our understanding of who we are and what is our history.
I wondered if you couldn't perhaps comment on Trump and his approach to Putin and Zelensky, kicking Zelensky effectively out of his office for being disrespectful. Um, any comments on that, or did you have another avenue that you wanted to end up on?
No, no, I have to take Trump into account because here we are concluding, the Ukraine war began under Trump. When Trump was very proud about it, that he was supplying the Ukrainians with Javelin missile and ATACMS and all the weapons when Obama administration had refused to do that. Obama administration was responsible to bring about the coup d'etat on February 2014, but it did not escalate to providing arms and equipment as happened under Trump. So, and under Trump, also, Trump tore apart the INF agreement with Soviet Union and then Russia, that is the Intermediate Nuclear Missile Agreement, Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, which led to the Russian then to go forward and develop their own intermediate weapon system. Most importantly, the hypersonic missiles that have now come into play, and the Russian version of that hypersonic missile that was displayed, the Oreshnik, in Ukraine. So yes, Trump is deeply, in that sense, involved, even though he wants to say repeatedly and has said repeatedly in recent days that this is not my war, this is Biden's war. But that is again trying to airbrush history and give it a different texture to it, which is not entirely true. Um, But yes, the other side is very rapidly. I mean, we don't have to go too deep into it, and we don't have the time. This is the Russian side of it. It has played out, as you can see, with the financial oligarchs supporting the Bolshevik Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, and then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, again the oligarchs coming into play to both engage in Russia during the period of Boris Yeltsin and the early period of Putin in exploiting the weaknesses of Russia to buy up factories, to buy up mines, and so on. And many of these oligarchs and plutarchs are of Russian Jewish origin. And same thing in Ukraine. I mean, Zelensky himself is a Ukrainian Jew, and he was put in place by one of the biggest or largest Ukrainian oligarch, Kolomoisky, another Ukrainian Jew. The bulk of the Eastern European Jews, in that sense, come from that part of the world, and so they have been involved and they remain involved in ways that are not fully disclosed. But in Russia, Putin has expelled a lot of them out, to tighten up. And that's, again, the attack that Putin is a dictator and Putin is another Hitler and so on and so forth. And anyone who speaks in favor of Putin then becomes a Putin, whatever the term is, idiot, I suppose that's the term, Putin follower. So that's the one thread of that double helix. The other is, of course, the primary interest of the neocons, which is the Israel first aspect of their politics. And all of that then was at play in the period after John F. K's assassination. Here, just quickly, just to again highlight this thing, from after Truman as the president, Truman was the 33rd president, to Donald Trump, who was 45th and 47th now in numbers, there have been, in my count, 13 men. Kamala Harris didn't become a president, otherwise we would have had to say, 12 men and one woman. But 13 men have followed Truman into the White House. And among those 13 men, because Truman is the one who established the relationship with Israel, recognized Israel, supported Israel, only 2 presidents have stood up to challenge or question or to call for a cease and desist orders on Israel. One is Eisenhower, who, being what he was and his stature in American government, first as the supreme commander in the Second World War in Europe, and then as the president, his stature being big, he was untouchable in that sense. So when in the Suez crisis and the collusion between Britain, France, and Israel to drive into the Suez Canal area when Nasser nationalized it, and then to bring about a regime change, if possible, overthrow Nasser, take over Sinai Desert. Eisenhower stepped in no uncertain term and called the cease and desist, basically, and reversed the whole thing, that if they didn't do that, then there would be drastic consequences, both from the United Nations, resolutions that America would push for, and then American action, unilateral action, that could cripple the economy and, of course, the arms supply and so on and so forth. So that was one, and the second one was the successor to Eisenhower, John F. K. And John F. K's was the cease and desist on the Israeli secret effort to acquire nuclear weapon, the Dimona project that had been built with the support of the French before de Gaulle came to office in 1958. And Kennedy wanted a full disclosure on that. And so that is the backstory also in the forces that came together, the convergence that came together in the elimination of Kennedy from office in 1963. Except for those two, all the other presidents, that is, the 11 others, have been surrounded by Israel first. And so, not openly, they were known as neocon. That began in the Reagan administration, and it has followed through, gathering greater and greater momentum in terms of number and influence, and the position that they came to hold from Bill Clinton onwards to Donald Trump. And what is the neocon agenda? The neocon agenda that now is at full display is what was worked out by Israelis themselves. What is the right-wing Likudniks, Likud party, that is Menachem Begin's party, and they're known variously as revisionists or neo-revisionists, but they are the Likudniks. That is the Greater Israel agenda. Eretz Israel, renaming Palestine as Judea and Samaria, and then historically stretching the borders, expanding Israel into that imaginary Judea and Samaria, and extending it all the way into River Nile and into Euphrates. And this agenda was circulated among the Israelis, that was then picked up by the neocons in America during the Clinton and then most importantly during the Bush administration, which is that the Likudniks' strategy, a man by the name of Oded Yinon, Yinon, Oded Yinon, a strategist in the Likudnik group, wrote the paper describing what should be, and the paper was called The Strategy for Israel in the 1980s, what should be Israel's strategy. And the strategy was worked out that Israel should target all the Arab states and exploit the internal weaknesses of the Arab state in terms of sectarian politics, the division that exists among Arabs, that is the Shia, Sunni, and the various sects within each of these states, and the minority Christian population and so on, exploit that and break up these states and create mini states out of them, and then force them into to go under the influence of Israel and accept Israeli dominance. And that experiment was launched by Begin in 1981-82 with the invasion of Lebanon, to splinter Lebanon. Why 1981-82? In 1979, under Sadat, Israel signed the first peace treaty based upon UN Resolution 242. And that signature or that signing of the treaty removed Egypt from the collection of the confrontation states with Israel. And so now Israel had the free hand to move against states on its flank, that is Syria, that is Lebanon, that is Jordan, and so on and so forth. So without getting into the details, this strategy was picked up by PNAC. And we find that, a strategy that Israel wants to get rid of, as was later articulated by General Wesley Clark when he was told. General Wesley Clark had served as the Supreme Commander of NATO in Europe after his retirement and after 9/11, when he was visiting the Pentagon. He was informed by the officials in the Pentagon and by the generals there, his colleagues who were working under Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense for George Bush Jr., and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, one of the leading members of neocons, that the Bush administration had decided that there would be war and 7 countries would be invaded and removed. And when he asked what are those 7 countries, the list of the 7 countries was Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Sudan, Somalia, and Iran. And so in 5 years, those 7 countries would be attacked. There would be regime change, and so on would be brought forth. And so the ideas from Israel was again put through PNAC and through the neocon into the Bush administration when they came to power after the 2000 election. And in the interim, there was another strategy paper that was prepared for Bibi Netanyahu's government that came to power in 1996. And the neocons in America were party to that strategy paper. It is called the Clean Break. And among the neocons who participated in writing that paper was Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, and David Wurmser, who all are involved subsequently in writing the PNAC paper document. And in that, the very term, the clean break, what was the clean break? To emasculate all the agreements that led to the Oslo Accord. And therefore, to open up the room for Israelis to begin the strategy of securing Israel's agenda by the ethnic cleansing, completing the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, first in Gaza and then in the West Bank. So these are all documents that are now available that we have gone through, I have gone through. And this was 1996. You will recall, and we have talked about this in our previous podcasts, and I've written about this. In 1995, Isaac Rabin was murdered. And why was he murdered? Because he was a man who committed Israel to the Oslo Accord, to the two-state solution, on the basis of both UN Resolution 242 and UN Resolution 181. And so all of this preparation was then channeled through the neocons into the American administration. And that came about, the opportunity. The question was, all of these ideas need to be ignited or unplugged and put into practice. But for that, a pretext has to be there, or an event has to take place that will then provide for the strategy that has been worked out to be put into effect. And so here it is, right from the pages of PNAC, the document that you have on your hand. If you open the page 64, it's right on the top of that document. It said, this process of putting together these ideas, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one. You have to infiltrate, you have to put into place. Absent some catastrophic and catalyzing events like a new Pearl Harbor. that if there is another event like a new Pearl Harbor, a Pearl Harbor type of event, then of course all of these strategy can be rolled into one and put out and pushed through. And what was a new Pearl Harbor? This is 2000.
A year later,
Pardon?
9/11, yeah.
9/11. And now we know, all of us were shocked beyond belief of what had happened. And the first report and then the first narrative that was put into place through the 9/11 report was that 19 Al-Qaeda fanatics, terrorists, hijacked planes, wide-body planes, and flew them into the two towers of the World Trade Center. Almost a quarter century later, we now know, at least the circumstantial evidence provide a counter narrative, so to speak, that this was an inside job to put it together. That such an event could not have happened without the prior knowledge or even the involvement of people within the CIA, within the other intelligence services. And that led to this new Pearl Harbor event, this catastrophic event. We also now know from historical record and the archives being open that the original Pearl Harbor, 1941, was also in that sense a contrived event, that the American naval intelligence had broken through the Japanese code, and they knew what was coming. And this information was on the desk of President Roosevelt, and President Roosevelt kept it private, did not inform the people, the relevant commanders, so that the attack on Pearl Harbor would immediately precipitate America to go into war. Because what was holding America back in the interim when the war started in Europe was the America First movement, which had as high as 80% of the American public opinion behind it, not to get involved. And, this is what is now derogatorily called the isolationist mood, but this was the America First move. There's no business of America. Charles Lindbergh and others were all involved in it, and 80% was a huge number, almost that number that was opposed to war. But it was flipped overnight. Yeah. December 7th, the Pearl Harbor event takes place. On December 8th, America was at war with Japan, and then Germany declared war on America, and America was fully in the war. So 9/11 became the new Pearl Harbor, and it provided, basically in Benjamin Netanyahu's term, now America knows what Israel has been going through, that is terrorism. And so we are again united together at the hip, and everything is okay. What Israel does, we have to jointly work together to destroy the very source of these fanatic Muslim, these radical extremist Muslim, and take the war to them. And so immediately after 9/11, what had already been decided, going all the way back to 1980, the Oded Yinon policy paper presented to the Likudniks in the 80s, that led to the Israel's invasion of Lebanon. They had already identified that Iraq has to be deconstructed, destroyed. Saddam Hussein has to be removed. And whatever the consequence happen, if Iraq is divided into its various sectarian groupings, So be it, so much the better. And so immediately, Paul Wolfowitz, in the very first meeting after 9/11, called for the elimination of Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And the question that Saddam Hussein was not involved in 9/11 was overridden by the whole argument of weapons of mass destruction. In 1981, Menachem Begin had bombed the nuclear reactor which France has supplied to Iraq, the Osirak reactor, and it was identified as one that was helping Saddam and Iraq to acquire a nuclear weapon, and that was destroyed by the Israeli Air Force by the orders of Menachem Begin in 1981. And ever since, the whole argument was that Iraq is, surreptitiously, secretly trying to acquire weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, bacteriological, chemical, etc. And it has to be removed. And so after 9/11, George Bush goes to speak in the Congress, and he talks about the necessity of preemptive action before any of these radical Muslim organizations acquire weapons of mass destruction, and then unleashes that onto America.
And of
Uh,
course, underlying all of this, Salim, is money and the military-industrial complex, which I believe we could probably safely say is non-partisan and has only one agenda, and that is making money. And if you think about it, Israel, the amount of money that the United States has spent on its 51st state, forget Canada, de facto, Israel is the 51st state of the United States. 1/3 of $1 trillion has been spent in the defense of Israel by the United States in 2025 dollars since 1948. And of course, the billions upon billions, hundreds of billions of dollars now being spent on Ukraine, and the money spent in Vietnam, and all of these conflicts that we've talked about, Iraq, the military industrial complex sitting back and taking in the money from all of the neocon agenda of world global, Trotskyism, democracy imposed upon everybody. Yeah.
because when it comes to Biden and Trump is let's put it on the table and that in a sense um, not only wraps it up is where we have arrived, and the question is for the American people, how are they ever, if they wish to be once again a sovereign independent people as George Washington and the founding fathers established America for, um, how are they going to extricate themselves from the situation that has come about? That is, in my metaphor, the double helix. The two thing is now embedded in the core of the American Republic. In fact, America is no longer a republic, as you have correctly pointed out. It is an empire. And in serving as an empire, America is jettisoning, it is trashing its inheritance as a republic, that is the Constitution, and the crown jewel of the Constitution being the First Amendment, that anybody who touches on the subject that you and I are talking about can be prosecuted, deported if they're non-American citizens by birth, and so on and so forth, which is already happening. So what has happened among so many different things, the thing that you point out lastly is the flow of money through the military industrial complex and through other means of assistance to Israel and to Ukraine that began with the Ukraine war, 1914, which is, by the way, the date that needs to be emphasized instead of 2022 when the SMO began. The
You
SMO,
mean you mean 2014. You said 1914.
sorry, 2014, because again, 100 years ago, the same thing happened, right? By the way, um, getting mixed up on a year, slip of tongue. Uh, you and I, as we are speaking right now, this April of 2025, is the 50th anniversary of the end of that disastrous war in Vietnam for America. It was in April 2025. As a matter of fact, on the last day in April 2025, April 30th, the last helicopter flew out of the American embassy in Saigon, the rooftop of the American embassy in Saigon, taking the Americans who were there, the last of the few Americans who were there, including the American Ambassador Martin, Graham Martin, and others, out of Saigon to the aircraft carrier in the ocean, outside of Saigon, 50 years ago. And I would bet my bottom dollar that except for the veterans and people of that generation, few Americans know or think about it anymore. That is, after almost a dozen years or more of that war and 58,000 Americans dead, whose names are now permanently embossed in that black wall in Washington Mall, and somewhere over 3 million people dead in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. And then there would be more killing as Phnom Penh and others engage in almost mass massacre and genocidal acts. That's the legacy. That's what we're dealing with, even in over this. So the money that is at play here, which comes from the taxpayers, American resources, it gets laundered through Ukraine, through Israel, back into the pockets of the American congressmen and senators.
War is a racket.
War is a racket. Smedley, Darlington, Butler, the most highly decorated Marine general. So what you have is the American taxpayers are providing money into the campaign for the American congressmen and senators to do the bidding of Israel, with which America has no treaty. There is no pact, neither with Ukraine, and the American presidents have gone along with this. As I said, after Truman, 13 American presidents, except two who were immediately after Truman, resisted. One was too big a name for anybody to touch him, and the other was eliminated physically. You know, so this is the racket. And where does Trump comes in? Where does Biden come in? Well, Biden was completely surrounded by neocons. His Secretary of State was a neocon, Anthony Blinken, his Secretary of Treasury, his Chief of Staff, his national security advisors. They were all neocon Jews. And then you have Donald Trump. And one would imagine that Donald Trump would have learned his lesson from his first term. But no, he comes back and he's once again surrounded by, in all the key national security position, by Israel first neocons. So you have his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is a complete neocon, though he's not a Jew. But he's an Israel firster. He is, as we understand, the handpicked representative in Donald Trump's cabinet as the favorite of Miriam Adelson, the widow of Sheldon Adelson, who have been among the biggest donors, that is, the Jewish donors, to Donald Trump's campaign. So he has people like Pete Hegseth, Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, and so on. They are all Israel first and neocons, and so he is surrounded by them. And in the case of Israel that we are talking about now, the second thread, what began all as part of the premeditated, pre-organized, pre-thought policy with October 7th. That was the pretext, just like 9/11, the false flag that has led to the mass slaughter or genocide, as the International Court of Justice has called as a quote unquote plausible genocide. They've yet to come down with their full report on it. And the ICC that has indicted Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister who stepped down, Yoav Gallant, for engaging in crimes against humanity and so on and so forth, a whole list of charges. The American administration, both Biden and now Donald Trump, is fully involved in it. I think I had predicted in our conversation that the the success or failure of the MAGA project, if Donald Trump comes back, will entirely depend, ironically, on foreign policy. Though he wants to be the peace president, whether he will be able to deliver what is required to be a peace president by all the people that he surrounded himself with and all who have financed him. And that's what we're seeing. So, as the French saying go, the more the things change, the things remain the same. And so we begin with Woodrow Wilson and who he got surrounded with, the big financiers and the oligarchs, both in the context of the Balfour Declaration and in the context of the Bolshevik Revolution that came about. The only thing that Woodrow Wilson failed to deliver, to get through, was joining the League of Nations that he had signed up for at the Paris conference. That was defeated by the America First senators in Washington, who did not want to take on any responsibility of an international sort, So they were sticking in some ways to Washington's farewell address, just George Washington's farewell address, and what you have so often quoted, John Quincy Adams, and so that phase from 1919 to 1941 is the phase which is looked back in such a negative and loathing manner by the neocons as appeasement rather than, or isolationism, rather than it was America trying to be true to its own Republican values, the founding values. And as you can now see, as you have done, read the document, PNAC document, as we have discussed these matters, you can see that one segment of the American population, which I defined in our previous conversation as the 2%, that is, of Jewish background, has ultimately been able to successfully, from their point of view, seize control of American foreign policy, and by seizing control of American foreign policy, had driven America in a direction that is completely contrary to its founding values.
Absolutely. And I always go back to John Quincy Adams because there are a number of American patriots out there who call themselves 1776ers or constitutionalists. And if they truly believe that, then they should study their own history to realize that the current foreign policy direction of the United States is contrary to Americanism. It is un-American, in my estimation, to have these views of a belligerent foreign policy, which is fueled by a military-industrial congressional complex and led by a neoconservative agenda these people have their own nefarious and yet in plain sight articulated agenda for a global Trotskyist agenda, which has only led to millions upon millions of deaths. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Salim. I do hold out some hope for the Trump administration. It's still early days. We're only 3 months into his term, his second term and last term, possibly last term of office. But I do hold out hope for it, that he would be a peacemaker and not just another in a long chain of people being led by neoconservatists. Thank you, Salim. Thank you very much.
Thank you.